Welcome to Levee These Times, the podcast bringing you conversations at the intersection of politics, culture, and the environment. I'm your host, Joe Ayoub, and today we'll be talking to Kretzschmar. She's a coordinator with the Stay Grounded network, which works on a global level to reduce air traffic and build a climate-just transport system. They recently published a paper entitled A Rapid and Just Transition of Aviation, Shifting Towards Climate-Just Mobility, which was a big part of our conversation. As is usual with these episodes, we ended up talking about a number of things, from the social and environmental costs of airport projects to the problem behind carbon offsetting. We looked for alternatives. We talked about the issues, for example, with tackling tax exemption for aviation. We discussed how flying is already unjust, the problem of frequent flyers, the fact that it's a small percentage of the population, the global population, that actually flies, etc., etc. Then we discussed Europe's lack of international booking for trains and how that's a big problem. We also discussed how trains are not necessarily the solution everywhere. For example, the Maya train project in Mexico is actually a big problem. And we sort of delved into the wider question of asking what kind of mobility do we need and want, and how can we distribute it in a just way. Of course, we're all dealing with COVID-19. We know that COVID-19 has already deeply impacted the aviation sector. So the idea is to look at how we can implement change by design rather than change by disaster. We spoke about, for example, the Green New Deal for the Gatwick region in the UK. We spoke about degrowth, we spoke about alternative tourism, the importance of intersectionality and the centrality of environmental justice, and so on and so forth. So, as I said, quite a lot of things were discussed. So this is the latest in a series of episodes on the topic of environmental justice. There will be more to come in the future. So that's it from me, and thank you for listening. If you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon or on buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and Buy Me a Coffee has both options. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts. The music is by Torabit. Thank you.
I'm Anne Kretzschmar. I've been working with the Stay Grounded network for around 2 years now, and also for the last years I've been quite active in the climate justice movement in Germany, and also involved in the debate of degrowth for some years. I've been studying economics, but kind of critical alternative economics, so where we're trying to rethink economics and see how we can how economic science should maybe serve better for the people, not for the profit.
So we'll start with Stay Grounded, since you work with them. How did the initiative come about, and what does it try to achieve?
Yeah, sure. So Stay Grounded is an international network. We have around 170 member organizations by now in 5 continents, and there are many members in Europe, like most of our members, but we also have an increasing number of members in the global south, and our members are NGOs, activist groups, grassroots, indigenous people that are resisting land grabbing for airport expansion. So a lot of different groups that have something to do with flying, mobility, airport expansions, resisting against that. And how the network came about was that in 2016, there were coordinated actions against the CORSIA scheme. So to explain that, that's the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation. So basically, a scheme to trying to offset emissions from aviation. And there was a resistance against that based on the idea that this is a false solution and we can't really offset emissions. And the people that organized those actions realized that there's actually not really a movement around aviation and that the problem is not addressed well. And there are no existing campaigns. So they started to organize and set up meetings and networked, and that was basically the initial start of this network. So that was 2016, and then it became more formal, and there were some general principles, like our 13 steps for reducing aviation and reaching a climate just mobility were agreed on by collective writing process. And the Stay Grounded network is working on many different levels. So on the one hand, we're trying to build a movement around the topic of the effects of aviation on the climate and on people, and make that visible and shape the public discourse, bring it into the public discourse. And on the other hand, we try to show how everything is linked. So aviation is not the single problem, but aviation is, in a way, can be seen as one of the manifestations of our economic growth capitalist system based on exploitation and extraction and everything faster and bigger and more. And showing how this is linked is one of our let's say goals. And also, of course, we're trying to do solidarity work, so show the struggles of our members, make them visible for everyone. So if there is a group resisting airports in the Maldives, we try to make that visible to everyone and show, okay, it's not just about noise here in the airport, but once there's an airport built here, there's an airport built on the other side of the world, and that's causing problems as well.
So to kind of just get into it, I would suppose, most listeners would be like me prior to reading the reports. So we know that aviation is a problem. We know we vaguely know about emissions, and of course it's a big deal. But what Stay Grounded is trying to do is not just point out this, which is I guess it's obvious to most people, but how does it also affect people? How does it also affect communities? What are the sort of structures that prioritize the building of airports and expansions of airports? And what are some ways to tackle that and tackle that problem heads on?
Okay, so first on the thing of most people know that, I think I maybe doubt it a bit, because very often the problem of aviation is downplayed a lot, and people are talking about, it's just 2% of emissions. But actually, now recent studies found out that it's around 6% of climate heating comes from aviation. And before COVID, we had this massive growth in aviation. So meaning that, by 2050, we could have 25% of global heating actually coming from aviation. So just to show that it's a bigger problem, and it includes also non-CO2 effects, which is also often not mentioned. So that's just on the question of most people know. So it's downplayed a lot.
Maybe optimistic on my part.
But you're right, there is an increasing debate on that, and that's, I think it's quite positive. And on the question of what other effects it has apart from emissions. So I think there are multiple factors. One is, of course, that airports are often mega projects that come along with replacement of people. Communities lose the place where they live and their acres or whatsoever. It comes along with, of course, noise pollution, but then also we have effects that are a bit, let's say, more indirect. So one thing is, and they are also related to what I talked about before, the problem of the false green solutions and the hope in technologies, because we have, for example, biofuels, and then there is that seems to be like an answer on using biofuels instead of kerosene. But then with biofuels, there are a lot of other problems that come along. So first of all, it might be a concurrence to food. When you plant crops for biofuels, that's one aspect, but it also very often comes along with land grabbing, so displacement of communities again. And the same is also true for offsetting projects. So here you have the idea that we can pay, like I'm flying, for example, and I'm aware of the emissions, so I buy an offset to have some project paid to the idea of offsetting is that you buy you buy a ticket in a way to offset your emissions. But then what happens is that there are projects on the other side of the world, mostly because often it's people in the global north buying those offsetting, and then projects in the global south. And those projects actually often also go along with land grabbing, with people being not allowed to enter their local forests, for example. And this is very problematic because it's a kind of neo-colonialism where you think you can free yourself from the sins with just paying money and letting people on the other side of the world, offset your emissions. I don't know.
Yeah, and I can give a concrete example of that. I was looking it up while you were talking. I live in Switzerland, and recently, I believe it was in October, Switzerland struck the world, quote unquote, world first carbon offsetting agreement with the government of Peru. And the idea is, and I can just read out the write-up here, in an agreement that took 2 years to negotiate, Peru will get finance for sustainable development projects while Switzerland takes credit for the emission cuts. And it's that sort of business in some ways that I've been increasingly concerned with. Of course, it's one of the legacies of the Paris Agreement, one of the limitations, many would say, of the Paris Agreements. My previous guests were presenting the societal transformation scenario, also made a critique on that point, which I will redirect to in the show notes. But yeah, so being based in Switzerland, kind of the link to my other question, it's a country that's pretty well connected by trains, even though it's not always affordable. But connections between European countries aren't always the best, and almost never cheaper than planes. Maybe I don't want to limit our conversation only to Europe. It's just because I'm more familiar with the train system here. But what can be done to bridge that gap in your view? And is it merely a matter of governments subsidizing certain means of transportation over others? And as I said, I'm just focusing on Europe because I'm based here, but feel free to expand using other examples as well.
Yeah. So what Stay Grounded published recently is a report called Degrowth of Aviation. And there we lay out different measures to reduce aviation in a just way. And we actually discuss different measures because we say this discussion is not happening. So what we have at the moment is huge tax exemptions for aviation. I mean, I live in Germany, so I know the numbers for Germany, that we have around 11 billion of taxpayers' money lost every year from the fact that kerosene is not taxed and there's no VAT on international flights. So that's really
extraordinary.
That's really a huge sum. So of course, this is totally a problem, and it's absolutely not understandable and unacceptable that kerosene shouldn't be taxed as other fuels, fossil fuels are. But on the other hand, this is of course not the only solution just to tax kerosene. So in this report, we lay out different measures and we say, okay, there's taxing of kerosene, there's taxing of VAT, there may be also prices on tickets, but there are also limits. So we have to discuss also how to limit actually flights, to put absolute limits, to put moratoriums on airport expansions, because what we really don't need is more growth. We really need to put a limit. And we also discussed in which ways those measures are just, because with price mechanisms like a tax, you often have the problem that yes, you can lower the demand with that, but it can also mean that only the well-off can fly, and that's of course not a just solution. So when we actually look at the numbers of flights, we see that in itself flying is already very unjust, because they're for example, only 1% of the world's population causes 50% of commercial aviation emissions. So that's a huge amount. It's really a small minority of frequent flyers that are responsible for the biggest share of this problem. So when we use price mechanisms that actually don't affect the ones who are very well off because they don't care anyway, then that's not the solution. So one of the mechanisms, one of the things we suggest is that we also talk about actual limits. because this will solve one of the problems. We also talk about a frequent flyer levy, which means that taxes increase with each flight you take. So the people that really fly very often, they're taxed much more than others, and people that just take a flight every other year to maybe visit their families on another country, they're taxed less. I think what is also important in this is that we need actually a discussion about what are necessary flights and what are not. Because in the end, if we limit flights, we have to talk about this, right? And this is not an easy, I think it's not an easy discussion, but we need it because, like, for me personally, there's no reason to fly. I don't miss it. I don't need it. But there might be people that have had need to flee from their country, and then of course they need to maybe visit their families abroad. And of course, I don't see a reason to forbid that or to make it extremely expensive or difficult for them. And there might be also for emergency reasons need to fly, but there's no need for a shopping trip to Paris. So those discussions are needed, I think. And on the other hand, we need also very practical and straightforward solutions, which is, of course, supporting better railway systems. In Europe, we have a big problem that there's no international booking. So when you want to go from one country to another by train, you have really problems getting your train rate insured. You sometimes have to book 3 trains through 3 different systems. And there are a lot of initiatives that actually work on this, like Back on Track or We Autant de Nuit, a French group, or also Erasmus by Train, a student group that tries to bring forward the idea of going to your Erasmus by train. And yeah, so there are initiatives working on that, and some things are moving on the question of night trains, but there have been a lot of mistakes in the past decades with really destroying in a way the railway system we had. And then on the international level, I would say there are also examples of good train systems. Like in India, there's a very good train system that connects most regions. In other countries, there are very good coach systems. But I think what we also experience in the network, and where we are very happy to have this variety of perspectives, is that you always have to look at the local situation. Like, for example, now one of our members in Mexico is resisting the Maya train that is being built there. So there we can also say not every train is good. This is the Maya train is a very intrusive infrastructure project that is actually threatening the communities there, and it's just built for mass tourism and for profit, and not really for a just mobility. So we always have to look at the local situation. And coming back to your question of whether this is just a matter of government subsidizing certain means of transport over other, no, it is not. It is also, so we do need different measures. We do need the end of those tax exemptions, but we also need the discussions about what kind of mobility do we need, what kind of mobility do we want, and how can we distribute it in a just way.
Yeah, thank you for that, and for the correction as well. The emphasis is on just mobility, and it's sort of like the new, I don't know if I would call it trend, but like it's definitely a new awareness in the climate movement of focusing on environmental justice, on social justice issues in general. And I'll preface the question I have on, like, if you can expand on what does just look like what are some examples of that. I'll preface it by just reading a bit of the paper here, and I'm quoting here. It cannot be an option anymore to use taxpayers' money for bailing out polluting airlines, airports, and related manufacturers. Instead, recovery packages must be directly used to finance a just transition, for a living wage and social protection for workers leaving the industry, restraining programs, the creation of jobs in climate-safe sectors, and for fostering alternatives to flights and mass tourism. Public money must save people, not planes. So can you sort of expand from that? Essentially, what does it really look like for those who may not be familiar?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a quote from our most recent publication, a discussion paper on just transition of aviation. So here the just aspect is about what do we actually do when we transform from one sector to another, because of course when we demand less aviation, that means it might mean a loss of jobs, and we're always confronted with this topic because in some regions airports and airlines are a very are the ones giving the jobs to people. So, and there of course we don't want to work against workers. So the idea, like the demand for just transition, has been developed by trade unions and climate justice movement together. And the idea is that protecting workers and communities currently depending on fossil fuel industry doesn't mean only protecting jobs, but it means also to bring forward a process that safeguards long-term security and the future of the workers and the planet. And often we have this argument that we need to protect jobs, and by that, this is used to delay the changes needed. And the idea of a just transition, we want to manage these changes effectively and fairly and democratically. So a very important part of this just transition, I think, is that the whole process includes a social dialogue with workers and communities at all stages. So it's not something imposed from above, but it's really done in dialogue. And on the other hand, it must also be rapid, because the longer transition takes from the fuel-based industry, the more unjust and difficult it will be, because the effects of climate crisis won't wait, and they will also be very unjust. So those are the two aspects I think we need to look at here. And yeah, the principles. So in our paper, we wrote down, we tried to formulate some principles of a just transition, and they are providing social protection is the first one. And this should be in a broader context of supporting livelihoods. So not necessarily this one job, but the livelihood itself of the people, of the workers and their families, that they can meet their basic needs also during time of unemployment, and that trainings are provided. And the second principle would be promoting the creation of alternative employment. So really see, okay, what is the skill of that worker, and in which other sector could they go, which other sector is available in that region or close by that could be, where the skill could be used. And then also an aspect is investing in skills development and retraining. So offer this and pay that people are retrained and can develop new skills. One aspect would be also to halt new training and employment in aviation, because we would say that we don't need new growth, new training in aviation, but need the transition. And but one important part is also the global support for a just transition. So look at the global scale of this aspect. So that means that we need substantial financial support for global south countries from historic emitters. So that also here we have the justice aspect from the north to the south. And I think because maybe we didn't make that clear in the beginning, that this paper or this idea is especially so important now at the moment, because we actually do have already a downscaling of aviation through COVID-19. And so that's also how we came to make this discussion paper, because we say, okay, people are losing their jobs now, and we need an answer to that. We do have in the degrowth debate, we often talk about change by design or by disaster. And what we have now through COVID is a change by disaster. So people are actually laid off from their jobs. They don't have a protection of their livelihoods, And with this just transition paper, we say, okay, hang in here. Now we need to see how we can protect those workers, but at the same time transition them to other sectors. Because if we don't do that, the next crisis, the climate crisis, will hit and endanger them and their livelihoods again.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. And it's very important because this has generally been a weakness in the climate movement in the past. And, you know, we can think of the coal miners in America, and it was at least partly, it wasn't necessarily the main thing, but it was partly one of the factors that allowed Trump to appeal to a certain segment of the population there by, you know, appealing to the return to the mines and that sort of thing. And I did feel, even speaking recently, that there hasn't really been a very vocal part of the climate movement, or like progressives or others, who would say like we do, there is a genuine concern there. There are actual people losing their jobs. It's not something that can be just ignored. And it is important to obviously tackle that question, because if we don't tackle that question, well, someone else is going to tackle that question in a much worse way. So there is an example, actually. We mentioned in the pre-chat an example. I think it was in Limburg, Netherlands. Can you mind expanding from that?
Yeah, so there are some examples. Actually, in the coal sector, we mentioned one in our transition paper about the Netherlands, where they had a coal mine where they closed the coal mine and 70,000 jobs got lost, but the government provided subsidies for new businesses and relocated industries from the capital to the impacted regions and provided training. So there are some examples of that in the sector of coal. Often, however, there it's for transitioning to gas. So I'm not sure about whether that's actually the solution. But maybe if we want to talk about one example, I would really like to give the example that is not implemented yet, but is a proposition. Be a very good a proposition could be a very good example for just transition in aviation, and that's the idea of the Green New Deal for Gatwick. So what they did here, and what actually is in a way the next step from our just transition paper, to be very concrete, they did so Gatwick is the second largest airport in UK, and it's very hardly hit by the COVID-19 crisis, with a loss of job losses and the highest unemployment rate currently. And what they did is an analysis of the situation and the dependency of jobs in the area on the airport, and see how, lay out how this dependency is unhealthy, and also given the prospected development of the aviation sector, because we now see that even the aviation industry itself says, okay, it will take a lot of years to get back to business as before. And then they're showing how current reactions and bailouts fail to protect workers and livelihoods, because what we saw in the last year was a lot of money, like billions of money, going to the industry in bailouts that actually didn't secure livelihoods and workers, because there were no binding conditions towards no binding social or environmental conditions. So this report is showing how the government actually failed to do something here. And then they're analyzing the existing skills in the region, acknowledging that people also feel attached to their work and the industry, and they're laying out the sectors where those skills could be used elsewhere, with a concrete examples showing direct job creation potential, and then giving numbers what this could cost and how it could be financed. And so they're doing this very specific for Gatwick region, and I think this is a really great thing, and this is what we need to do in the region. And it's really gaining traction with the local authorities now. It's being discussed there. I mean, I don't know how promising it is that something really will change, but we're having conversations here about the potential implementation, and I guess that's a really positive example. And yeah, maybe another example that to me was very inspiring was, even though it's not directly got towards the was not a direct success was the Lucas plan from the Lucas Aerospace company in the UK, which in the 70s was threatened by a lot of the workers were threatened to be laid off, and to defend their jobs, they proposed an alternative, socially useful applications of the company's technology. So they sat together with unionists and they said, okay, what can we with our skills produce that is socially useful, has a social benefit that we actually need for our society. And to me, this is very inspiring, because here you have workers that sit there and say, okay, we're made redundant. Actually, nobody needs what we're producing here. So we sit together and we think, okay, what can we do with our skills? What does society really need? And so that's a really inspiring example for me, and how this just transition should actually happen.
A lot of the discussions that we've heard, like around COVID-19 and just in the past year or so, when we say like the big symbolism of how we want things to go back to normal is a return to pre-COVID tourism, essentially. There's a lot of, of course, the images of, Paris being empty or London being empty or whatever, all of that. Of course, that's shocking and dramatic. But a lot of the discussion, even to this day, I do agree that there's definitely some change. The Green New Deal for Gatwick is a good example of how there's this increased awareness of we can't actually go back to pre-COVID-19 numbers. This pre-normal wasn't really normal, et cetera, et cetera. So like, when we talk about tourism, for example, when we talk about, British tourists always going to Spain, or even larger, British tourists always going to America, or vice versa, what have you, what are some ways of tackling that also heads on, like local tourism, et cetera, because in the same way as the aviation industry or workers in the aviation industry are being impacted and will be impacted, of course, with climate change and so on, a lot of regions of Europe, of Asia, of so many segments of the world are dependent on tourism. So what are ways of doing it, not just quote unquote sustainable tourism that's not really sustainable, the offset issues that you mentioned before and so on, but maybe more actual, palpable ways like local tourism and so on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And it's part of our, it's not the focus, but for sure part of this discussion paper that, of course, tourism is very strongly connected with aviation, and and there's also a sector hit very hard by COVID-19. And we were in Stay Grounded, we were talking with our members about this already pre-COVID. We had in 2019, we had a conference on degrowth of aviation in Barcelona. And there we worked together with a lot of local groups and movements that are actually fighting tourism and its effects in Barcelona. And there, I think we saw very clearly how over-tourism can have so many bad effects on a city and the communities living there.
Absolutely.
Because it's pushing the prices a lot. People can't afford to live in their own city anymore. They're living kind of in a museum. They're pushed out of the centers. Everything is made only for tourists. The big ferries are destroying the environment of the ports, and and there we wrote some articles together with those local initiatives. And actually in Barcelona, we also have some positive examples of resistance against this. So they started to limit the numbers of tourists. They started to put to limit their Airbnb flats that could be offered, and trying in a way to give the city back to the locals. And now with COVID, we have also, I think in Spain, this discussion is going on for some time. And also now we had a statement from the union CCOO, so the Workers' Commission. It's the largest trade union in Spain, together with environmental organizations, urging for a diverse tourism that is directed more to the countryside, not only to the capital, and that's focused to have tourism for people close to where they live, so that not tourism of very long distances, and that is not dependent on aviation, and that is more connected with cultural and artist heritage and sustainable outdoor sports. And so this is also, to me, a very promising teaming up of unions and environmental movements. And of course, globally, this question is even bigger, because you have whole nations depending on tourism, and it's not an easy question. It's of course also not a question that you can solve immediately, because you have those dependencies, and it's not a solution that has to take away the tourism for good, and then of course people depend and their livelihood depend on it. But now with COVID, we see what happens if one region or one country or people are totally dependent, like a monoculture of tourism in a way, dependent on tourism, because then it's not sustainable in a way of long, like, securing long-lasting security of livelihoods. And there, I think we need programs that actually support countries to go back, go forth to a more diverse local economy that is not dependent on foreign tourism, because like that you always depend from other countries, and I think that is really difficult. So one of our steps within at Stay Grounded, of our 13 steps towards just mobility, is also an economy of short distances, which means that economy is that we try to change our economy more to local economy and support that, instead of being dependent on this far distance economy that we have now.
Yeah, right. So it's another example of preferring change by design rather than change by disaster.
And I think through COVID we have a lot of disaster now.
Yes.
We see this everywhere, and I think the challenge is really to make at least a little bit of design out of it, and learn for it from future for further crises, and not just go back to business as usual, and then we'll have the next crisis and the same problems will appear.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you please talk a bit more about how the paper was, and I'm quoting here, a collective writing process by people active in the climate justice movement, workers in the aviation sector, trade unions, indigenous communities, and academics from around the world, end quote. You already mentioned this, of course. I will sort of say that I have a number of indigenous groups that I will be interviewing in the future, but they're not confirmed yet, so I can't plug them yet. But it is one, like even that sentence alone, that intersectionality, we might say, it's one of the signs that to me indicates, when I read that in the paper, it indicated that this is something that's different from some of the previous models that sort of don't look at the social aspect. One of the critiques of the climate movement up until fairly recently, we should say, and it's not, the Green New Deal, the Sunrise Movement, Fridays for Futures, all of those things, those are indications of the new ways of doing things, but we still have, in many, many sectors, big NGOs that still apply the old way of doing things, which tends to ignore local economies and local workers and so on. So can you talk a bit more about that, the intersectionality of it all and why that's so crucial?
Yeah, sure. I think what you just mentioned is it's really key, and it's something that in my opinion, the climate justice movement has really to put a strong focus on this justice question, because we will get nowhere if we just reach 1.5 degrees, but in a very unjust and exploitative way. And there's a possibility for that. I think a lot of green solutions are leading us directly there. So what we have to really strongly put an emphasis on as climate justice movement is this justice aspect. And for that, we need the people affected by that. And so, for us, it was natural only to be in dialogue with workers and unions when we want to talk about just transition. And luckily, we do have in our network also progressive unions like the PCS, Public and Commercial Services Union in UK. So in general, I would say that in our one of the advantages of our network is that we have a broad range of members from very different fields. So we really do have this expertise already within our network. So when we write via our list, we have really a range of perspective and opinions. And so we try to use that. We started with an open brainstorming with everyone who's interested. Or yeah, maybe going back a bit, we had the Save People Not Planes campaign when the first bailout started. And we said, okay, we need to link any bailouts to social and environmental conditions. And then we actually realized, okay, no government is doing that. And we said, okay, maybe it's even not the solution. We don't need bailouts going to the industry at all. We actually need bailouts or any money going really into recovery funds or yeah, into rescuing livelihoods, protecting livelihoods, and not planes and the industry. And so we started with this open brainstorming within our network. We had an online discussion with inputs from trade unionists, from pilots, from an activist from the Dominican Republic who brought in this question of tourism only, also, and how it's interconnected with aviation. And after that webinar, and the brainstorming process, we took in a variety of literature on just transition, and the first draft was made by a working group that consisted of those different people. And then we had various feedback loops within the network, trying to take in as many opinions as possible. And yeah, I think one of the thing that was really helpful in this was that we have close contact with this group called Safe Landing. So a group of critical aviation workers, as they call themselves, the people who formerly worked in the aviation industry or even still work there. Some of them were made redundant or decided themselves they don't want to work there anymore and are now active in the climate justice groups or movement. And this was very important to have their input because they have the insight from the industry and can say, okay, this is where the problems lay. This is where the industry is doing greenwashing. This is where people are really relying on jobs. And then we had the unionist perspective, of course, that also takes into account all those all those opinions of the workers. And a very active member of ours is a group of indigenous people in Mexico who always contribute a lot to our publications, who are resisting the airport in Mexico Valley there, and they also inputted on this question of global South perspective and tourism, dependency on tourism, and the protection of indigenous communities and their rights. So yeah, that's maybe how this process went, and it was also a clear decision to call the thing a discussion paper, because we didn't want, and I think that's also an important aspect for the climate justice movement, not to go there with ready solutions, but we say, okay, this is what we think, and this is the options we see, and let's discuss this now. And I think that's what is the next step now, what needs to happen now, and what is happening, that in the different countries, I mean, it was translated into many languages, the paper, that now we start really having discussions with the local unions, with the workers, saying, okay, those are our ideas. What do you think? What do you need? What can we do together? How can we join forces? Where do you see the problems?
And thank you for also mentioning the critical aviation workers. I didn't actually know of that term before. It sort of belies in some ways, or at least it contradicts the narrative that we usually see, that it's all a matter of like either we protect jobs or we save the environment, and those are the only two options usually given to us, obviously by politicians and lobbies, etc., who are invested in these things. sort of related to that, on the website, you share I think it's called airport related injustice and resistance map. That was very interesting for me to see. Can you sort of just explain what that map shows? And obviously I will link all of this in the descriptions.
Yeah, this is a project we do together with the Environmental Justice Atlas. And we have around the globe a lot of new airport projects, and they often involve land acquisitions, destruction of ecosystems, displacement of people, local pollution, health issues. And more and more airports, especially in the global south, are also becoming so-called aerotropolis, so airport cities that are surrounded by commercial and industrial developments, hotels, shopping cities, logistics centers, whatever you need. And this is also, this is then a special economic zone. And coming back to the tourism question before, this is exactly what we don't need to support local economy, because then you have this aerotropolis for the airport. People fly there, they go shopping there, and they go back, and no money is actually going to the country itself.
Right.
And so together with the Environmental Justice Atlas, we identified more than 300 airport related environmental justice conflicts in a research project, and more than 70 are already mapped in in-depth case studies. And this mapping process is collaborative. Some cases have been handed in by local initiatives, others have been mapped by a research team, and we're currently working on a new interactive feature map on aviation, where viewers can delve even more into the topics and the injustices related to aviation by activating different cartographic layers, providing country-based information or something like that. To us, the solidarity and the publicity and press work we do as network for communities threatened by airport and airport-related projects is very important, because it shows this complexity of the problem. It's not only about noise or emissions, but it's about many more things. And just to give a very recent example, right now, this week, while we're talking, basically, in Via Nazaré, in a small town next to Porto Alegre in Brazil, we have the German company Fraport, who is driving the eviction of the last remaining families there, because they're building a new runway or have an extension of the runway of the local airport. So here we have an international company that is evicting local people, threatening their livelihoods, and not giving them the rights, or that they not giving them their rights, but displacing them to build an airport.
Yeah, thanks for that. And before I forget, I would also say that the discussion paper you mentioned is put forward is available in a number of languages, and I would urge listeners who are able to translate to check stay-grounded.org. The link again will be in the description, to see if their language is missing and whether they can contribute to expanding into other languages as well.
That's a really great idea. We do also have volunteer pools for translation, because we often need translation, and we will be very happy for people sharing this discussion paper in their local context, also giving us examples of where maybe transition is going on, just transition more.
Awesome. So, is there anything that you'd like to discuss that I missed before we go on to the book section of this episode?
Well, I mean, there's probably a lot that we could continue to talk about in this topic. I think we already got through a lot of the topics, and the discussion thing is really important to me. Let's discuss about that and see where are solutions. How can we join forces to really transform this crisis and make something out of it, go out of it in a just way, transform our society, and in this case our mobility system in a just way that is not on the back of workers and on the back of the planet.
Absolutely. So we're entering the book section now. I'll ask you to just recommend 3 books that you've enjoyed and that you might feel are just go for it.
Yeah, so I think one book that was really inspiring to me, or one author also, is Emma Goldman, so an anarchist from the 19th, 20th century, and her book Vision on Fire, which is actually a collection of her writings about the Spanish Revolution. And there you also have this question of workers taking over their companies and reorganizing themselves. So that's really inspiring to me. And another one is Reimagine Change from Patrick Rainsborough and Carl Donnan from the Center of Strategy-Based, I forgot the exact name, but Story-Based Strategy, that's it. So it's about how important are narratives for our fight, for our struggles, and how we need to have a vision of where we're going to. Yeah, and the last one is maybe actually not a book, but a very small clip. It's called Years of Repair, a message from the future. It's from the Intercept and the Leap, and it's to me a very very inspiring and encouraging video, because it shows in a way how we could rebuild our society from the ground up after we went through all of the struggle that COVID-19 means. And it's a story of a lot of struggle, but also a lot of solidarity and a lot of work that actually comes from this crisis.
And I will say that Years of Repair was partly designed by Molly Crabapple. She's a good friend of mine, and she was a guest on this podcast as well to talk about her. Speaking of Emma Goldman, slightly adjacent topic on like the Yiddish Bundist movement at the time and that sort of thing. So I'll take advantage to plug that episode. It was quite fun to do. And thanks a lot for your time. This has been, a very dense and compact conversation, which I hope listeners will also agree with me. And I will do my best to include all of the links and relevant info in the usual blog post on the website and in the description.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.